Hello and welcome to Rach Aquarelle. My name is Rachel, and in this video I'm going to be demonstrating painting a nice, bright, bold sunflower. And before we get started, I just want to go over some of the things that you will need. So the first thing that I have here is just a sheet of printer paper, and this is what I will be doing my initial sketch on. And I just want to make sure that before I start painting, I really have a good idea of the shape of this flower. So I'm going to do all the messy work on this sheet. And once I have a really nice sketch, I will also upload that, and you'll be able to follow a link in the description to get the template, and then you can use that if you would prefer not to do your own drawing. But I will walk you through the drawing process and how I simplify flowers. Next, I will be using some carbon paper to transfer my sketch onto my watercolor paper. And carbon paper is something that you usually can find at any office supply store. It's a little bit outdated now, people don't use it as much, but it's very inexpensive, it's easy, and one sheet will last literally for years. So it's definitely worth looking for. And I also have links to the carbon paper that I buy through Amazon in the links in the description. Next, this is the watercolor paper that I'll be using. This is Fabriano watercolor paper, 140 pounds. And this sheet is 9 inches by 12 inches. And of course you'll want a pencil to do your sketching and your transfer. Then of course you'll need some watercolor. And I'll go over the colors that I plan to use for this painting. I have more colors on this palette than I need to use, and so I'm just going to point out the colors that I plan to use in this painting. So the first is going to be this new gamboge, and please keep in mind that you do not need to have these exact colors. This is a warm yellow, so any yellow that leans a little bit closer to orange will do. And on my palette, it's this color right here. Next, I have Windsor Lemon, and this is a nice cool yellow. And the way that you can tell that this is a quote-unquote cool yellow is that it is a little bit more like a lemon yellow, hence the name Windsor Lemon. Next, I have Scarlet Lake, and this is a warm red. And it's a warm red because it's a bit of an orangish red, and that would be this color right here. And then I have Permanent Rose, and this is a cool red because it leans a little bit closer to magenta, and that's this color right here. Now, this color here is actually just another well with Windsor Lemon in it. The reason that I have this on my palette twice is that I often use this color when I'm mixing greens or even oranges. And since yellow is such a light color, I really want to have two wells of this because the one that I use to mix, it will inevitably get a little bit muddied up with the colors that I'm mixing it with. So this yellow I'm going to try to keep very clean, and then this one I don't have to worry about so much. Next is Windsor Blue, green shade. This is very much like a phthalo blue, so it's a very warm blue. It leans a little bit toward green, and that would be this here. And this is a very strong, powerful pigment, so whenever you're using it to mix, add just a little bit at a time because it's very, very overwhelming. Next, I have French Ultramarine Blue, and this is a cool blue. It leans a little bit closer to violet, and that would be this color here. And I use this blue a lot, and just for comparison, there's this bottle or tube, and then this tube. So there's a big size difference. These little ones usually come in a set, but I find that I go through this so fast that I would need about 3 this size to keep up with the rest of the colors. I just tend to use it a lot. And then I'm going to show you some of the brushes that I might use. So right here I just have an assortment of brushes. It doesn't mean that I will use all of them, but I like to have several handy. So this is my largest brush, and this is made by Jack Richardson. It's their Gray Matters line. And this is a 3/4 of an inch brush. Next is my Gray Matters size 10, and this is a round. And round brushes are very versatile because they have a nice pointy end, especially when they're wet. And you can also use them with more pressure to get larger applications. And these Gray Matter brushes are all synthetic. This will be my smallest brush. It's a Gray Matters size 4. It's also a round. So this will be handy for doing dry techniques and detail work. And then last I have my Mop Brush. And this is a really great brush for doing washes and wet applications. Of course, you will want to have paper towels handy. I usually just keep these in my lap, so you may not see them on camera. But sometimes you need to get the excess water out of your brush. And this palette that I'm using is a ceramic palette, and I really like the feel of mixing paint on ceramic. And if you're interested in one of these, I do have a link. I have a list of supplies on Amazon that I frequently purchase. So if you're interested in getting anything that you see that I have, I believe that I have everything linked there. And of course, you'll need your water handy, and I usually have at least 2 glasses of water handy so that when one gets dirty I can just switch them out. Then I have just painter's tape. This is just masking tape that is a little bit less sticky than traditional masking tape, but if you have artist tape, that works as well. And I use this applicator just to reactivate my watercolors. I don't have to add a lot of water right now because I actually just refilled these wells, but just to kind of get those going. And now I'm going to get ready to sketch my sunflower. And this is just a board. It's a nice smooth surface. This is my printer paper again. And I'm going to use my mechanical pencil to do my sketch. So flowers can be a little bit intimidating to draw because usually when we look at a flower we just see all of those delicate petals layering and overlapping one another. But I find that I can usually draw a pretty accurate flower if I just start with some basic shapes. Usually for flowers, I'll start with an ellipse, and then I find the center of the flower. In this case, the center of the flower is angled in a way that it is a little bit off center because we're looking at the flower from an angle. And so if I use that center point of the flower as my anchor or my starting point for the petals, and that larger ellipse as the outer boundary for the petals, it usually works out pretty well for me. And I think that once you get some practice drawing flowers, it actually becomes a very relaxing experience of observation. But of course, I will actually have a template for this painting available for you to download and print at home if you would like. And then I will soon be showing you how you can transfer the template onto your watercolor paper using carbon paper. So I'm just observing the flower and I'm just kind of looking at these petals as organic shapes. And I'm not worried about being overly precise because even though I am using a photo reference to draw this, I know that if I get the generalities correct, then even if every detail isn't there, it's still going to look like a sunflower. Though I will say I made a change from my photo reference. I decided to make the center of this sunflower smaller than it is in the photo, and this is allowing the petals to be quite a bit longer and more prominent. Alright, so I'm ready to transfer my sketch. So I'll set my sketch on top of my watercolor paper, and then I will hold that in place with a couple of pieces of my painter's tape. That way I don't have to worry about the paper shifting And then I'll place my carbon paper with the dark side down, facing my watercolor paper. And now the key here is to find the appropriate amount of pressure to trace over the template with. So I'm going to go very lightly over a few petals, and then I'm going to check and see how that's transferring. So you can see that's pretty light. I might want to apply just a little bit more pressure. But it's better to go too light than to start out too dark. You can use an eraser to erase the lines from your carbon paper to some degree, but typically most erasers will not completely erase a line that is too dark. And before I remove my template, I'm just checking to see that I haven't missed any lines, which I have. So as long as you check before you remove your template, you won't have to worry about realigning your templates over your watercolor paper. And now that I have my transfer complete, I'm going to use my painter's tape to secure my watercolor paper to my board. I'm going to be using a lot of water, a lot of wet technique in this painting, and there will inevitably be some buckling of the paper, but as long as it's secured to a nice firm surface, then everything will flatten out. And now I'm going ahead and getting everything set up, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to see everything. And I have my water over to my right, and I've dipped my mop brush into the water, and I'm just generally wetting the paper. I'm not worrying about all the corners at this point, just basically the large center point. And I'm using my lemon yellow to very softly begin to block in the petals where I can see a lot of light, a lot of translucency in the petals. And so I'm using my lemon yellow to represent the parts of the petals that are receiving the most light, and not worried about staying within my drawing, and also just letting that wet paper soften all of those edges on the flower and in the background. And now I'm using my warmer yellow to represent the petals that are being overlapped, or they're just not receiving quite as much light, and so they appear a little bit more opaque and a little bit warmer in temperature. And also toward the center of the flower, where the petals attach to the center, I'm noticing that the color is much warmer and more saturated. So now I'm adding a little bit of my warm red and my cool red to further warm up that temperature right around the center of the flower. And all of that is still pretty wet, so I'm just letting those edges do what they will. And as I apply this color around the outside of the flower, since this color is quite a bit different than the lightest parts of my petals, I do want to just make sure that I'm careful to maintain the boundary between those very light petals in the background. And now I'm just going in with a little bit more of that yellowish orange to define some of those petals. And now, while my background is still pretty wet, I'm going in with a blue glaze, and this is my Ultramarine blue. And I'm going to be using a lot of this in the background because I want there to be a lot of contrast between the dark background and these illuminated petals. So adding blue will create some sense of depth in the background, and it will also build up to be a nice contrast of dark versus light. And again, I'm just at this stage being a little bit more careful to maintain the boundaries between the background and then those very, very light petals. And as I move away from the flower, I can be a little bit more free. I don't have to worry so much. And as I look at my photo reference, I'm not trying to copy that background. I want to keep it pretty soft and abstract. So I'm really just looking for cues of generalized colors that I'm seeing in the background. So I'm, of course, seeing a lot of green. And then the darkest areas of the background I'm interpreting as a deep blue or even violet. There's also some warm tones in the background. And at this point, it's just important to try to work all around the background so that I don't end up with patches where the background has dried more than other parts. And so I'm just continuously working around. I'm also looking for cues of direction, so objects in the background that have a direction, such as stems, leaves that are more distant, but give some cue of shape or line. And I will want to have maybe one large leaf that belongs to the subject of my painting, a little bit more prominent in the lower right-hand side of the composition. And so I'm going to be careful not to put too much dark paint in that area as I continue to work on pushing that background further into the distance by using lots of my ultramarine blue, adding some yellow in there, of course, to create greens. And again, I'm just not being overly careful, and I'm sort of having to remind myself to loosen up regarding the background, because one of the challenges of using a photo reference is that we can tend to focus in on it a little too much and get carried away with all of the details that we can see. So sometimes it's a good idea to make yourself not look at the photo reference and just focus on some of the design elements of your painting. So contrast is going to be important. Creating some sense of depth or atmosphere is important. And so if you kind of just focus on those elements, it should help you to kind of loosen up your painting style a little bit. And now I am painting in the leaf that I want to be a little bit more prominent behind the sunflower. And every time I mix a color for the background, I try to find some other places in the background to use it as well, just to create a little bit of harmony and cohesion. And one thing to keep in mind is that I am every once in a while stopping and allowing my background to dry a little bit so that I can apply glazes and not have the colors mixed together. So glazing is a really good way to build depth and to help your values to go a little bit darker, which is a challenge with watercolor because it's so transparent. So right now my entire background is dry, and I'm going to be applying a glaze with my large flat brush. This is my 3/4 inch brush, and I almost wish I had a larger brush for this. So you can see as I apply this, it is transparent and it's just tinting some of the lighter areas of the background. And I'm not being too careful with where it goes, except of course I just don't want it to go onto the petals of my flower. And I'll use quite a bit of this around my background because it will help, of course, with contrast against my flower petals, and it will take the value down. And since it's a very cool color, it will also create a sense of atmosphere or depth. And I do kind of have a distant flower in the background. And I just don't want it to be competing with my focal point. So I want to make sure that it stays pretty soft and abstract, and also that it's not as bright and bold as my focal point. And I don't necessarily need that flower in the background to even read as a flower. I just want to have a little bit of variation in the background. And right now I'm applying more glaze, but this time I added a little bit of my permanent rose to my ultramarine blue. And even though that makes a violet, when I glaze it over some of these other colors, it just creates a very nuanced but deep color. And also, since the subject of my painting is a big yellow sunflower, and violet is a complementary color to yellow, adding some subtle violet to the background will help to make my flower stand out even more. And now I'm just letting things dry a little bit. I'm also going to clean off my mixing tray because the next thing I'll be working on is the petals of my flower. And so I want those mixes to be very bright and clean. And I'll first go back into my lemon yellow. And I'm just going to start lightly brightening those petals, although I don't want to completely obscure the lightest values on there because those will be important to show translucency in those petals. And I'm being careful not to use this yellow too boldly. So I'm balancing my pigment with water so that I just have a nice glaze. And now I'm using my warmer yellow to start addressing the petals that are receiving a little bit less light. So the petals that are receiving the most light, those are going to be that very bright lemon yellow. Petals that are either receiving less light or there's more foreshortening or more overlapping, those are going to be warmer in temperature. And this is where it's really good to start to notice the temperature of the colors that you observe. And if you think about the color spectrum, if you are looking at a yellow, but on the spectrum it's a little bit closer to orange, then that would be a warm yellow. And again, at the base of these petals, the temperature is much warmer. And so I'm beginning to go in with more orange. And this will help me to begin to define those individual petals a little bit. But I'm being very careful not to overuse these warmer colors because I don't want to obscure the light areas. And now I'm going to begin to work on the center of the sunflower. And we typically think of the center of a sunflower as being brown, but I'm actually mixing up a violet with my ultramarine blue and my warm red. And this kind of just creates a bit of a muddy violet. And when I glaze that over the yellow that's already on the center of the sunflower, it's going to help mute that violet, and it will appear as more of a neutral or brown. And one of my favorite things about painting is improvising colors. And you see that I have a lot of colors on my palette, but honestly, sometimes I forget about a lot of those other colors because I like just trying to mix every color that I need using just the warm and cool versions of the 3 primary colors. So I can typically paint an entire painting with just those 6 colors. And some of those other colors that I have on my palette have come in sets, and they, to me, seem so specific that I often can't find a purpose to use them. So now I have this very warm color. It's mostly my warm red. It's a little bit of ultramarine blue or cool blue. And then there's also some yellow mixed in there as well. And this is a very warm color in temperature, and it's a little bit more of a dark value. And I am using this to begin to define some of the striations in the petals that I can see, especially on those petals that are receiving a little bit less light. And I think that this is just a good subtle way to begin building up depth in petals without making the petals look too heavy or solid, which is what I think the primary challenge of painting flowers is, because those petals are so delicate and fragile, yet we see all these tiny striations and fibers in those petals. And so we want to represent those, but if we're not careful, then we end up with petals that look like they are very solid or less translucent, less delicate than we know they are. So with those striations, I'm focusing them more toward the center of the flower, where the petals are anchored to the center, because that part does tend to be a little bit more solid. And then as we move to the outer edge of the petals, they become increasingly delicate. So I need to be very careful and use very light washes if I want to apply any kind of striation at the end of the petals. So this is a mixture of a little bit more of the ultramarine blue and the warm red. And I'm keeping that mixture very watery so that I can apply it as a glaze. Again, I'm limiting this just to the petals that are foreshortened or receiving less light. And you can see that between the base of the petals at the center of the flower and the outer edge of the petals, we have a really nice contrast building up. And that really lends itself to the effect of translucency in those petals. So that contrast is very important, but it's something that you want to build slowly and carefully. And again, I'm mixing up that violet, and this time you can see it's much more concentrated. There's a lot less water in this mix, and that's so when I apply it, it is less translucent, and I can really use it to define that center of the flower and also those anchor points of the petals. And this is really the darkest part of this painting, even compared to most of the background. And I'm using it just a little bit in the stem, just to further define it. And I've decided that I want to get a little bit more of that lemon yellow into that leaf in the background. So that'll be a very subtle effect because that lemon yellow is very transparent. But I just wanted to brighten that up a little bit. And now I've mixed up a bit of orange, and I brought in just a little bit of that violet mixture into it. And I'm being very careful at this point not to go overboard on these petals. And I'm just looking for any areas that might need a little bit more contrast or show a little bit more overlapping of the petals. Adding a little bit of definition to that leaf, some of the veins in the leaf, and also softening the edges. And we're just about finished with this painting. We're very, very close. And really at this point, I might be fidgeting a little bit, which is something that I have a habit of doing. And so it's good sometimes to make yourself step back. I really try to actually step back about every 15 or 20 minutes just to see where I'm at. Now I'm using a little bit of just pure permanent rose, and I'm letting it be somewhat concentrated, and I'm just adding some accents around the center of the flower. So it's very orange in there, but I think just right at the base of those petals, it could use just a little bit of brightness and contrast. So definitely don't want to go overboard with that because I don't want to end up with a pink sunflower, but I think that that helps. And now I am complete with this painting, cleaning everything up, and I'm going to remove the tape very slowly and pulling outward so that I can make sure I don't rip into my painting, which is still somewhat damp. And let's have a final look at this painting. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll come back for more.